Hello, my name is Luke Morse, and I will be doing an extra credit video project for the brain and the nervous system. We're going to begin the project with describing the frontal lobe of the brain. If we look right here in this section, which would be the premotor cortex, the primary function of the premotor cortex is storage of motor patterns. We would move down to this area right here, which would be the prefrontal area, which is where we get the ability concentration, the elaboration of thought, judgment, inhibition, our personality, and our emotional traits. And right here in this area right here would be the Broca's area, which is where language production comes from. Continuing on with the frontal lobe, right along this border right here is where we would find the motor cortex, which allows for voluntary motor activity. Moving on now to the parietal lobe, which is right here, we will find that the parietal lobe allows for the processing of sensory input, sensory discrimination, body orientation, our primary somatic area, and secondary somatic area. Moving on to the rear lobe of the brain, we see the occipital lobe, which, if you haven't already noticed, these lobes kind of match up with the bones of the skull, the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and the occipital bone. So back here at the occipital bone, in the rear of the head, we would see the occipital lobe, which allows for visual reception and visual interpretation. So if someone were to injure the occipital lobe, it could result in functional blindness, which would mean that they would be able to see but would not understand what they were seeing. So a photo of a car would be able to be seen by this person, but actually understanding what the picture was would be incredibly difficult. And next we would be moving on to the temporal lobe right here, which is where auditory reception happens, expressed behavior, receptive speech, memory and information retrieval happens. So within here is where a lot of hearing is expressed, where we receive and understand words that are being taught, speech that is being conveyed to us from somebody else. And this is a big part of where we retrieve memories from, past memories and things when we study for an anatomy test. This is a big part of retrieving the information that was studied. Moving deeper into the brain, we would see that this right here, following this is a lateral ventricle. At the end here, we would see the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a part of the mind that allows communication between the two hemispheres. Obviously, this is only one hemisphere, considering that it's split down the middle. But it is responsible for transmitting neural messages between both the right and the left hemispheres. An interesting fact about the corpus callosum is that it actually is the largest bundle of nerve fibers in the brain, and it connects the two sides of the brain together. Another interesting fact about the corpus callosum, 1 in 4,000 infants are born without a corpus callosum. Many born without this structure actually go undiagnosed for years, being misdiagnosed with autism, depression, or ADHD due to failed development. It's not usually found until some sort of imaging is done, like neuroimaging, which can confirm the agenesis, or failed development. Taking a look back here, we see the cerebellum, which contains the arbor vitae, a flow of white matter here. The cerebellum receives information from the sensory systems, the spinal cord, and other parts of the brain, and then regulates motor movements. The cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements such as posture, balance, coordination, and speech, resulting in what we have as humans, smooth and balanced muscular activity, being able to stand upright and hold a pointer and small movements that allow us to do things articulately. As explained before, with the cerebellum being a major factor in smooth muscular movement and being able to coordinate movements correctly, damage to the cerebellum can lead to loss of coordination in your motor movement, which would be known as a synergia, and you would also lose the ability to judge distance and when to stop. Another possible inability that would happen would be the ability to perform rapid alternating movements would be lost, as well as movement tremors and staggering, wide-based walking. As for the arbor vitae inside of the cerebellum, it is responsible for bringing sensory and motor information to and from the cerebellum. The arbor vitae is located deep in the cerebellum, as you can see with this mid-sagittal cut right here. It is situated within the arbor vitae, or the deep cerebellar nuclei. We take a move over towards the brain stem and the spinal cord right here. We can see the pons. And the location of the pons is in the area of the hindbrain that sits directly above the medulla. The medulla oblongata would be right here, in this little hump underneath the pons. The function of the pons would be that it connects the upper and lower parts of the brain, and they serve as a message station between several areas of the brain. So it helps to relay messages from the cortex and the cerebellum. Now, functioning without the pons would be nearly impossible, as the brain would not be able to function. It wouldn't be able to send messages to the different parts of the brain, no transmission. It wouldn't be able to pass along notification that we have taken some sort of damage to the rest of the body. It would stop right here. There wouldn't be a way for it to move into the different parts of the brain. Taking a look back at the medulla oblongata, we would see that this little hump right here is again where the medulla oblongata would be. And the medulla oblongata is a continuation down the spinal cord, down next to the spinal cord, and down the rest of the brainstem. And this forms the lowest part of the brainstem, and it contains control centers for the heart and lungs. Along with control centers for the heart and lungs, it also does many other things that our body needs to regulate the rest of our system, including blood vessel function, digestion, sneezing even, swallowing. It's the part of the brain, this part of the brain is the center for respiration and circulation. Now, taking a look at the brain here, this whole section right here, and what would be covered right here had this not been cut, we would see this whole portion would be considered the cerebral cortex, which would be divided into the 4 different lobes. The frontal, occipital, the parietal, and the temporal, which is right here, down below. And the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that functions to make human beings unique. Distinct human traits, including higher thought, language, and human consciousness, as well as the ability to think, reason, and imagine, all originate from the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is what we see when we look at the brain. It is the outermost portion that can be divided into the 4 lobes of the brain. Each bump on the surface of the brain, which is not described very well from this picture, is known as a gyrus. So each little bump on this brain would be considered a gyrus, and each individual groove is known as a sulcus. Moving upwards into the midbrain area, where we would normally see right here is the thalamus. While the thalamus is just above the brainstem, the thalamus processes and transmits movements and sensory information. It's essentially like a relay station, taking in sensory information and then passing it on to the cerebral cortex, which again we described being shown up here in this area, which is what makes human consciousness. The cerebral cortex also sends information to the thalamus, which then sends the information to other systems inside the body. Taking a look down here, we see the pituitary gland. Near this Near this pituitary gland, right up here, this region, would be where the hypothalamus is, underneath the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a grouping of nuclei that lie along the base of the brain, near the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus connects with many other regions of the brain and is responsible for controlling hunger, thirst, temperature, body temperature, emotions. It regulates all of these things. It even controls sleep rhythms, circadian rhythms. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland by releasing hormones that gives the hypothalamus control. It gives the hypothalamus control over many of the other body functions.
Another section of the brain that is kind of controversial to discuss would be the limbic system, and we talked about it in class with Professor Glazier. And the limbic system is a little bit of a controversial area of the brain between neurologists, it seems. But the four main regions that can usually be trusted are the amygdala, the hippocampus, regions of the limbic cortex, and the septal area. These structures form connections between the limbic system and the hypothalamus, thalamus, and cerebral cortex. The hippocampus is important in memory and learning, while the limbic system itself is central in the control of emotional responses.
The basal ganglia, they're strongly interconnected with the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, and brainstem. But as I said before, they're also connected to several other brain areas. But the basal ganglia are associated with a variety of functions, including control of voluntary motor movement, procedural learning, habit learning, control over the eye movement, cognition, and it assists in emotional aspects of the brain. Damage to the basal ganglia usually causes problems with the control of speech, movement, and posture. The combination of symptoms is called Parkinsonism. I'm sure many of you have heard of Parkinson's, which is a disease which causes tremors in a person. It can be described as a difficulty with starting, stopping, or sustaining a movement, holding something, holding a spoon while eating, tremors, shaking of it. That's a big sign of damage to the basal ganglia. Just deep and inferior here, we would see the optic chiasma, and this portion of the brain is an X-shaped structure, which is formed by the crossing of the optic nerves in the brain, just beneath the nasal portion here of the brain, and the optic nerve connects the brain to the eye. In biology, the optic chiasma is actually considered to be one of the turning points in evolution, allowing human beings to have peripheral vision and a much stronger point of vision than our ancestors. Taking a look here, it is difficult to see, but there is a small pea-shaped gland known as the pineal gland, and while its function isn't fully understood, researchers do know that it has a major role to play in circadian rhythms with the release of melatonin, the chemical that is released in the brain to allow for the sleepy effect that we get. We begin to yawn and our eyes get heavy, so the pineal gland plays a major role in circadian rhythm regulation. Going back to the basal ganglia, which again has a connection to many different portions of the cerebral cortex and other brain areas, we would see the caudate nucleus, and both hemispheres of the brain have a caudate nucleus. They're both located centrally and near the basal ganglia. They are also situated near the thalamus, which is deep in the brain, close to the midbrain, which would be here. This would be the midbrain. And each nucleus features a wide head that tapers into a body and a thin tail. The caudate nucleus in each hemisphere of the brain plays a vital role in how the brain learns, specifically in storing and processing memories. It works as a feedback processor, which means it uses information from past experiences to influence future actions and decisions. So it's very important in development and the use of language. Specifically, communication skills are thought to be controlled mostly by the left caudate and the thalamus.
Another structure I'd like to discuss as part of the video project is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a highly selective semi-permeable border that separates the circulating blood from the brain and the extracellular fluid in the central nervous system. The blood-brain barrier is formed by endothelial cells in the capillary wall, the astrocyte end feet and sheathing the capillary, and the pericytes embedded in the capillary basement membrane. This system allows passage of water, gases, and lipid-soluble molecules by passive diffusion, as well as selective transport of molecules such as glucose, amino acids. The glucose and amino acids are crucial for the neural function. Specialized structures participating in sensory and secretory integration within neural circuits, specifically the circumventricular organs and the choroid plexus, they do not participate or have any connection with the blood-brain barrier, so it's easier for things to pass through here. The blood-brain barrier restricts the diffusion of solutes in the blood, such as bacteria or large and hydrophilic molecules into the cerebral spinal fluid, while allowing the diffusion of hydrophobic molecules, such as oxygen and CO2, hormones even, and smaller polar molecules. Cells of the barrier actively transport metabolic products such as glucose across the barrier using specific transport proteins. So basically, as we talked about in class, the FDA usually leans pretty heavily on allowing a medication depending on whether or not it can pass the blood-brain barrier. As I discussed earlier in the presentation, the corpus striatum is a collective name given to the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus within the basal ganglia. So the corpus striatum is just the grouping of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. And the lentiform nucleus or lenticular nucleus comprises the putamen and the globulus pallidus within the basal ganglia. With the caudate nucleus, it forms a striatum. It is a large lens-shaped mass of gray matter just lateral to the internal capsule. The putamen is closely intertwined with the caudate nucleus, the nucleus accumbens, and the globulus pallidus, which are together known as the corpus striatum. As I said before, signals are transmitted through these structures to the motor thalamus, the brainstem, the motor neocortex, which helps the body with all aspects of physical movement. Next, I would like to describe the fibers of the brain. First, I'll begin with the association fibers, which are axons that connect cortical areas within the same cerebral hemisphere. In human neuroanatomy, axons within the brain called fibers can be categorized on the basis of their course and connection into association fibers, projection fibers, and commissural fibers. For commissural fibers, or transverse fibers, they are axons that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. In contrast to commissural fibers, association fibers connect regions within the same hemisphere of the brain, and projection fibers connect each region to other parts of the brain or to the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid is the next structure that I'd like to discuss of the brain. It is a clear watery fluid that fills the space between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater. Cerebrospinal fluid has three main functions. The CSF protects brain and spinal cord from trauma. By giving it a sort of buoyancy, it gives it a space in between so it has room to be shooken up, or if it takes a blow, if you take a blow to the head, it gives it some cushion. The CSF also supplies nutrients to the nervous system tissue, and it can remove waste products from the cerebral metabolism. As discussed in class, CSF leak is basically when the cerebrospinal fluid is leaking out of the brain due to some sort of damage or a birth defect. We see that it's a much easier problem to solve in a child as their skull hasn't fully formed, which gives the ability to stretch out the different sections of the skull, the parietal, the frontal. Everything can spread. The baby's head gets very large, but as you release it, it will shrink back down and it can fuse normally. It's a much more problematic situation if it's occurring in an adult, because the skull is fully formed, so it starts to push pressure on the brain instead of pushing the pressure outwards on the skull. Sticking with the cerebrospinal fluid, we'll talk about the channels of the cerebrospinal fluid. The intraventricular foramen in the brain. This is the channels that connect the paired lateral ventricles, the empty space in the brain on the two sides, with the third ventricle in the middle line of the brain. Production of the cerebrospinal fluid takes place within the choroid plexus, which is a plexus of cells that produce the cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles of the brain. The choroid plexus consists of a modified ependymal cell.